Everybody, my name is Meg Huey. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the senior training specialist here at Freedom Network USA within our housing team. So just a couple of quick tool notes. I know Em just went over a few of these, but as a reminder, Abigail, if you could go to the slide with logistic things on it. We have the chat feature available for you today, as well as the Q&A feature. That chat you're going to go ahead and use for things when you're prompted by our speakers today. If there's things that they want you to engage with, you can go ahead and use the chat for that, as well as for doing things like continuing to introduce yourselves today. And the Q&A box is going to be available for you to answer or to ask any questions throughout the presentation. Both of our presenters today have graciously agreed to answer questions as they go along. However, if something doesn't fit in with what they're talking about at the current moment, they may save it till the end. So please submit your questions to that Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get those addressed during the training. Any that are not addressed during the training, we will also share with our speakers today so that they can answer them in written form after the fact. Next slide, please, Abigail. The next note for folks is that we always want to recognize that we are on stolen and native lands across what is known as the United States. So we at Freedom Network USA are based in what is called Washington, D.C., which is also the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people's lands that were stolen from them. We want to pay our respects and recognize that these are the lands of past, present, and future Indigenous peoples. If you would like to learn whose land you are on, we would recommend that you visit the link on the screen there, which will also be in the chat for you, nativeland.ca. Here in Michigan, where I am on the land of the Potawatomi people. Next slide, please, Abigail. Next, I just really wanted to quickly introduce you to who we are at the Freedom Network Training Institute and the FNTI Housing Training and Technical Assistance Program. So we do a lot of things, as you can kind of see from the icons on the side of the screen here. We do a lot of web-based trainings, webinars. We have a free resource library that we'll share out with you in the chat in a bit here. And we also offer technical assistance to our OVC TTA grantees. So for folks that are interested in receiving various TTA opportunities from us and having conversations with us, please reach out. There are opportunities available for you. And for folks who are interested in receiving specific housing TTA from us at Freedom Network, we encourage you to apply for funding in the future so that that's an opportunity that you can take part in. Next slide, please, Abigail. All right, so next we wanted to talk about what the Housing TTA project framework is, kind of what the principles are that guide the work that we do. So the first principle is voluntary services, which means that survivors can choose how much or how little they engage in support services outside of the housing assistance received. We really are recognizing that survivors have different wants and needs as they are engaging in services, and it should be okay and respected if they don't want everything that a program has to offer. Next, we believe in being survivor-centered. If you go back, Abigail, one slide, thank you. For survivor-centered means emphasizing self-determination and ensuring that voice and choice are centered and respected. Really, what that means, again, is that survivors should be the owners of their own story and that they should be given the opportunity to know and advocate for what is best for them. Next, our next principle is being equitable, which means centering inclusion and prioritizing service delivery from an equity lens and understanding that not one size fits all. Next, culturally responsive, which is the ability to effectively serve clients of different cultures by humbly drawing on and seeking knowledge of client cultural needs for integration into services. Again, these are the principles that guide the Housing TTA project framework and what we do here at Freedom Network USA. And in all of the materials and webinars and things like that we put out, these are the things that are guiding us along the way all of the time. Next slide, please, Abigail. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to our phenomenal presenters today, and they're going to go ahead and get us kicked off as well. First, I'm going to turn it over to Caroline, and then Wyanette will follow up. So, Caroline and Wyanette, please take over and introduce yourselves. For folks that are also looking for their more full biographies beyond what they share with you, those were also available in the registration emails. So, please also review their full biographies if you'd like to learn more about our phenomenal presenters today. Thank you both so much for being here, and we're really excited to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Meg, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. We have 124 people in this space with us today. So I just want to take a minute to thank you all for joining us as we talk through economic empowerment and housing programs. Once again, my name is Caroline Ouya. I am a program manager at Futures Without Violence on our workplace and economic justice team. I work on a project that seeks to promote education and employment opportunities for survivors of trafficking and gender-based violence in general. But I do center trafficking survivors in the work that I do. And I have an extensive background as a legal advocate for survivors of violence. I've been director of strategic partnerships for large organizations that are doing economic empowerment work as well as legal advocacy. And so I bring all of that into our time together today. And I also center mental health within my conversations about economic empowerment. So you'll see me bring that up a lot, and I'm willing and excited to sort of engage in conversations around that. And then the last thing that I'll tell you is that I also believe in joy and hope. Right. And so that's why I love economic empowerment. I think that sometimes when we're in the anti-trafficking space or working with gender-based violence, it can be very daunting and heavy. We're focusing more on the barriers and the challenges. But I'm hoping by the time you walk away today, you can see economic empowerment as a wonderful tool to build joy and hope and resilience within all of our communities. So yeah, that's a little bit about me, and I'll pass it over to my awesome colleague, Wynette.
Thank you. Hamad Aweka, everyone. Hello, my name is Wynette Tasker. She, her pronouns. I'm Lumbee and Eastern Band of Cherokee, and I am the executive director of my consulting firm, Indigi Ripple Connect. Prior to becoming a TA provider, I did direct services within housing and shelter programs. So I do bring a background full of not really doing all of the things in the tiers of economic empowerment, which is what made me so excited to be a part of this project. So I have been doing technical assistance since 2015, a lot of tribal work, state level work with the STOP, VAWA, VOCA administrators, the OVC work, OVW work, HUD work. So, different kind of areas of bringing survivors into safer, more accessible, more culturally specific housing options. Yeah, so I'm currently a full-time consultant with IRC, and I am honored to be working alongside Freedom Network, and I'm honored to be here today. Next slide. All right, so what are our objectives today? We're going to discuss the opportunities and challenges of incorporating economic empowerment into housing programs. We will explore those 5 tiers of economic empowerment and why it's a helpful framework for housing programs. And then we'll identify key strategies for supporting survivors with education, employment, and financial resources in short, medium, and long-term housing programs. Next slide.
Thank you for going over those objectives, and hopefully that's what you're here looking for today. And so before we move forward with the content, if you can go stay on this slide, I want to set the foundation for our time together right quick. The first is that many of you in this room have so much wisdom and insight, resources and experiences on how you're helping survivors in your community navigate the barriers to education and economic opportunity. So I just want to take a minute to just lift all of you up and say thank you, for all the ways that you are engaging in this work. And if you have gems, based on what we're hearing, resources that have been helpful to you, examples, that are attached to what it is that we are walking you through today, please feel free to engage in the chat box, and we'll do our best to lift some of those best practices up as we're continuing with our presentation together. The next sort of foundation or intention that we need to be very clear on before we can really move forward is that economic empowerment work is not easy. Because we're living in a society, in an ecosystem that doesn't have all of the resources together in a way that makes it accessible, especially for a lot of the communities that we're working with. So, when we look at discriminatory hiring practices, if we look at a minimum wage of $7 on the federal level, and many other systematic barriers, right? It makes our work as advocates, whether we're in the workforce development side or the housing side, really struggle to do this work well. Right. And so if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling any of those emotions that come with navigating difficult and challenging systems, we just want to say that's okay. And we hope that this helps to support you in navigating those feelings. Next slide. Yeah, so let's get a pulse. Who's in the room? And kind of what are you all doing? So we're going to launch a poll. And the first question is, what economic empowerment, economic justice, or financial advocacy programming does your agency currently offer survivors? So if you can take a minute to think about if you're in the nonprofit or if you're in a housing program, or a community agency, what are you all currently offering survivors? And we'll go ahead and launch that poll.
One moment, we are launching that now.
Okay, so you should see the poll in front of you, and it should have the options of employment, experience building, skill building and work readiness, career exploration, crisis management, and then other. And if you choose other, go ahead and put it in the chat box for us to take a look at. And then the next question is, does your agency have a designated staff member whose primary responsibility is economic empowerment? So if we can get an idea of that. Okay, Kimberly, I see that you mentioned rental assistance is the way that you all are doing it. Thank you for lifting that up. I see partnerships with companies and nonprofits to employ survivors. So I think that would probably go under employment stuff if you want to check that piece out. We have housing shelters. That alone, right, is a resource. So thank you for lifting that up. And then renters education. Okay, Ashton, you mentioned FEC for our county. Could you spell that out a little bit? And then if you can go ahead and launch the results of the poll. Okay, so it looks like a majority of you all are doing crisis management, about 69% of you. And then right after crisis management is skill building and then employment. So those tend to be the top three that are utilized. And then when we look at who is doing the work, There seems to be about an even split. So 45% of you have someone who's designated to economic empowerment. I feel that feels good to hear, because often we hear it's one person who's doing everything, right? And then 40% of you said no, and then a few of you are unsure. So, okay, so this is helpful. Thank you so much. Next slide. So we'll continue with some of the insight that you all have provided via these polls to help sort of set the foundation of why focusing on economic empowerment and this tier structure can be very helpful. I'd like to lift up a study called Thawing Out that was back in 2017. It was a small community of about 30,000 people in Alaska. Launched their first or a new facility for homeless residents. And this facility matched a housing first model. So some of us are housing first, some of us aren't, but this particular facility was a housing first model. And after 6 months, they did some questioning of the people in this facility to kind of figure out, like, what's changed? Has this facility been helpful? What have you gained from being here? And this is what was found out after 6 months. The first theme was that these community members saw that housing did improve their lives in terms of giving them access to basic resources, right? But a lot of the people within those housing programs after 6 months still felt frozen, still felt that they were in survival mode, still felt that they were relying on old coping skills, right? Even after 6 months of a housing intervention. So that's where the term thawing out is. Emotionally, we're frozen. We're not really moving too fast, even though we have all of our basic, not all, but some of our basic needs being met as a result of being connected to a housing program. The next theme that we saw is that a lot of the residents of this particular housing facility, they had this feeling of everything has changed, but nothing has changed at the same time. So everything has changed in terms of their physical environment, right? They're no longer, if they were living on the street or if they were, insecure, moving from one housing situation to another. They felt that the physical environment had changed, but they were still stuck in stress. They were still managing new relationship dynamics and challenges as a result of being in their housing program. So there's a piece of them that still felt like, I'm still in the same place, even though some of their basic needs had been changed. And then the third theme that we saw was just like, and many of you have seen this across many various areas of work, is that relationships with others and community building was critical in assisting with changes over time. One of the most important things that I want you to know from this particular study when you go back is that it talks about thawing out as this concept of it requires time and it requires the right environment. So throughout our presentation together, let's think about that we're not going to figure this out in 6 months, right? Like, we're not going to figure it out in 6 months, because according to this study, we're still frozen. Survivors are still frozen. They're still feeling like things haven't changed. They're still looking to figure out how to be within their community, right, in an effective way. So I think that this context is very important to get an idea of where the survivors are at. Next slide. And so to add another layer of context to this conversation, I recently, 2 years ago, did a focus group with an organization that serves the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. And these were all housing participants, trafficking survivors. And we had conversations with them about, how do you define economic empowerment? What kind of economic empowerment services are you looking for from the organization that you are working with and from advocates? And these are the themes that came out of that focus group and that discussion to help provide context. So the first is that a lot of the survivors and families in our housing program had severe anxiety about exiting the housing program. They felt that they were idle, that within those 6 months, they weren't really working towards their self-sufficiency in a way that they wanted. Right? They felt that there was not necessarily a clear exit plan and a clear transition plan that made them feel comfortable about exiting the housing program and being confident on their own. And they also felt that they were getting inconsistent communication from staff. One housing staff member telling them, when you leave, this is how we're going to support you. Or while you're in the housing program, we're going to help you get your resume and all of these different things. But it wasn't necessarily consistent with the level of economic empowerment services and programs and sort of safety planning that they were desiring for leaving out of the housing program. Another thing to think here is that survivors weren't sure about what supports were available to them. They wanted to be involved in education. They want to go get employment opportunities, but they're not sure of how, and they don't feel that they're being told how in a way that they can understand from the advocates that are within the housing programs, or even some of the partner agencies. There's some unclear system in place about how to access these resources. And then the last is what we all know, is that there are a lot of barriers to opportunities. So we've just named 3, right? These were the 3 that were the most common for this particular group. One was childcare. There were a lot of parents in the room that were like, I want to take advantage of all these things, but who's going to watch my kids? Was transportation. So the location of some of the housing programs, we're looking at safety, right? Maybe it's in a safe location, but it's not in an accessible location. Transportation might not be available there to be able to get to some of these opportunities in the community. And then the last is just money for the trainings and opportunities. So let's say someone already came in with a dream of being in the beauty industry, right? And in order to go into that situation, it costs money. And they weren't sure how to access the money that they would need to take advantage of the training programs that are available in their community. Are there any questions about this context? Like if you've seen this, if you felt this, maybe if you can engage in the chat box and we can lift that up so that we all feel that we're not alone in some of these experiences that have been given back to us. But what do you think about this? If you can put that into the chat box and we'll go into the next slide. Okay, next slide. Oh, perfect. Here it is. Samantha, yes, those are definitely most of the barriers I see as a case manager. Thank you, Samantha, for that affirmation. A constant thread I've noticed, everything has changed, but nothing has changed. Eugene, thank you for lifting that up. And I think that that's something that overall in this field, we need to start having more intricate conversations about. Okay. And Janine, this is why I hired a life coach in order to reach out to other programs and focus on employment. Thank you so much for that feedback. So what did we do with this, right? Now we know what we've heard from from the research. We know what we've heard from the focus groups that we're doing out in the field. And so this is one of the deliverables that sort of have come out of these conversations with advocates in housing programs. About 2 years ago, Futures Without Violence, a workplace and economic justice team, created what we call the 5 tiers of economic empowerment. And these 5 tiers were adapted from the Department of Labor Workforce Program standards. So if you look at the Department of Labor, there are standards that they have created for what makes an effective education, employment, workforce development program. Right? And these 5 things that we're talking through are key components of what make a good, well-rounded economic empowerment program from the Department of Labor side, right? So what we did is we created the 5 tiers of economic empowerment, taking those 5 standards, but then being able to look at it from the perspective of if we were serving a survivor of trafficking, what would we need to know? What are the resources? How do we tailor it? Now, from that particular guide, Waynet and the Freedom Network partnered together to apply those 5 tiers to the housing, to the different types of housing models that are out there. So if you look at the link that's been placed in your chat, that is the guide that has been able to take the 5 tiers and tailor it into a housing program. If you can go to the next slide. So what are the 5 tiers, right? And then we'll talk a little bit more about what they look like in housing programs. The 5 tiers, and I lost my notes, here we are. The 5 tiers has these different stages. And we start at crisis management. You can enter into these stages at any point in time, right? But if we were going to look at it as a trajectory, we start with crisis management and we head towards employment. And what I want to give you are some framing questions for each of these tiers, right? Because the how is magical. The how is creative. You all are doing the how, right? But I want to give you some contextual questions around each tier, and then we'll go into the explanation of what this could look like. So the first is crisis management. During crisis management, you're asking yourself, what barriers to learning and living does a survivor have? And there's been a lot of research on the difference between a learning brain and a survival brain. And the goal in crisis management is to do as much as you can to move a individual from operating out of a survival brain, right? So this is, I'm iced out. Like, you can't get to me because I have put all of these protective barriers in front of me, to then supporting them with all of the resources they need to move closer to a learning brain. So that is essentially what you're doing under crisis management. And you all are doing that every day within housing programs. And we don't really have to go into the details of that. And then we go into career exploration. And the framing question there is, how can we expose survivors to more, right? How can we expand the options and opportunities that a survivor knows about, right? So if they come in and their only idea of a job based on where they are in community is, one thing, how do we expand that and give them multiple visions of what a career or education or job can be? Then for skill building and work readiness, the question that we're asking here is, what skills would enhance and prepare survivors for the workforce or whatever their economic goal is, right? Like, what skills would they need? And then going out to the community to ensure that they're getting those skills. The fourth is experience building. And the question that you're asking yourself here is, where can survivors practice their skills and enhance their experience? Everything that we do, y'all, it's a muscle. We're practicing it. We get better and better over time, regardless of whether you identify as a survivor or not. So in the experience building place, you're just providing as many opportunities for someone to practice the skills that they are learning, whether that's public speaking, whether that's dress for success, whatever it may be, right? That's what's happening on that tier. And then the last is employment. So what you're asking yourself here is, where are the quality and safe jobs for survivors? And what do we need to do to get those jobs and maintain them? Because it's not one thing to just put a survivor in a job. We want to make sure that the environments we're putting them in is, or assisting them in connecting to, because we're not putting anyone in anything. Let me be clear about that. That we are assisting people with are safe. Especially because with trafficking survivors, a lot of the violence happens within the context of work. So there's a lot more energy that we have to put there, okay? Are there any questions about these questions to consider for each tier? And then we'll go into sort of the tangible examples, but are there any thoughts about what you've heard about these framing questions for each tier? If you can engage with us in the chat that way. Tiffany, I want to lift up your point and then we'll go to the next slide. You said you believe it's difficult for some clients to understand that certain housing programs have an employment requirement. And so how do you work with giving survivor, what I'm hearing there is how do you work with giving survivors choice, right? And voluntary versus this is just the requirement of the program overall. I think that's a beautiful question that I love that you put in the chat box. And if anyone has insight for that, go ahead and put that in there for Tiffany and all of us to look at. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more. Next slide. Yes, Vanessa, experience building is very important. So what is not in this 5-tier framework? So I want to be clear that the 5-tier framework is not the end all be all, right? We have talked to you about these systems that are challenging. And so, you know, it doesn't mean that this is the answer to all of our economic empowerment issues within housing programs. It's just a helpful guide to start with. So what's not included? The first is that this guide does not include economic justice, best practices, or principles, right? So we have conversations among our groups about guaranteed income, you know, raising minimum, you know, addressing living wage jobs, food security, healthcare access, you know, things like that that are under the economic justice umbrella are not being addressed in this particular guide. That's a whole different conversation, you know, and I'm more than willing to talk to you about that. The other thing that we do not address in this guide, we mention financial literacy and we include some great resources related to financial literacy in the guide, but we are trying to be much more expansive than financial literacy, right? So we didn't go into that. Different things like cash assistance programs, entrepreneurship and cooperatives, like other models of economic empowerment that are not employment, we didn't dive into that in this guide. And the reason that I want to emphasize that is because everyone's goal is not employment, y'all. Everyone's goal is to not get an education. You know, and for some people, it's because that's just not their goal. They never saw that for themselves and they don't want to see that for themselves. And then there's other people who have accessibility issues, whether it's their health, whether it's their mental health, whether it's, you know, their ability to engage with some of these systems that are not accessible for everybody, right? And so it's very important to ask ourselves that if the person's goal is not employment, right? And if the person's goal is not education, how can we still use these principles and questions to connect them to meaningful opportunities and resources? Because we all do want to feel valuable. We all do want to contribute to some part of our life, right? And so maybe the way that we change the conversation, the way that we have the conversation and what our goals are for economic empowerment of survivors may be very different than what you've mentioned, Tiffany, what the goal is for that actual housing program. So that's where our hats as an advocate comes in, right? To try to like maneuver those discrepancies.
Caroline, we did get a question in the chat if you're open to taking a look at it and answering it now. Someone asked, can you dip into some of these tiers prior to others, such as skill building before career exploration, since sometimes clients take a while to identify their goals or change their goals?
Yes, that's a wonderful question, Samantha, and that I love that you're thinking of that way. The answer is yes. This is not a linear trajectory, right? So for you, it's to really figure out when you're meeting with an individual or if you're working with a cohort of housing, you know, participants, what are they ready for, right? What are they ready for? And the reason that I love your question is because it shows that you can engage a survivor in economic empowerment regardless of where they're at on their healing journey, right? So if it is skill building and that's what they're ready for, that counts, right? If they're still in crisis management and we're not ready for more, that's okay, right? If they're coming in and they're already did a lot of work to be resourced for themselves and all they need is more connection with employment, then that's a focus, right? So that's the individualized piece of it. But that's my long way of saying that yes, Yes, you can dip in and out of any tier based on what you know about your community. So we'll give you some examples, but then the implementation side of it is where the creativity comes in. Next slide. So with that, and then I see one, let me, thank you, Kristen. Okay, so I see one more question, and then I'm going to pass it over to Annette to start to walk us through the different housing models and to give you some more concrete examples of what this could look like. So Gerald, you said, are there pros and cons to decriminalizing the past history? And what is the lay of the land? Do most locations decriminalize for trafficking victims? Gerald, I might need a little bit more help with being able to answer this question correctly. Are you talking for survivors of trafficking who have a criminal record? Are you talking the conversation between decriminalization? Like what, could you help me provide me with a bit more context to that question so that I can make sure that I answer it correctly? I will also lift up that if you are talking about individuals who have a criminal record as a result of their trafficking experiences, we are going to be talking about that in our section about the intersections of this work. So yeah, for those with a sex trafficking prostitution. Okay, perfect. So let us hold that until we get to that section. But thank you so much for the clarification. All right, go ahead, Annette.
And just to maybe like piggyback on what you were saying, Futures does have a ton of resources and a ton of TA guidance. So while we are focusing on the tiers today, there are amazing resources on other types of like financial literacy and things that are available. And as always, all of our activities should meet survivors where they are. And so it's not a fixed process. And as we go through these housing models, it's not an all-inclusive list. These are ideas. These are some guidance to help you with implementation strategies. And then you have to figure out, how that aligns with your capacity, how that aligns with your program and your staff strengths and gaps. And yes, it's definitely adjustable. Certain tiers kind of line up with certain timelines. And so that's kind of how we have it broken down into the housing models. But you can also offer it during like follow-up. So this really isn't something that is super fixed and set in stone. Also keep in mind that all of this is voluntary. Like we're always focusing on voluntary services. This is not a requirement. This is an offering. We don't have expectations that they're obligated to participate in any of this. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. So you can only pick one here. So pick whichever one is closest that you feel connected to. But which housing model type do you maybe spend most time working in if you work in multiple? Short term, medium term, long term, and you can also pick multiple models if you want to. And then we'll talk about what exactly short term, medium term, long term means as we get there. All right, so poll results, we've got 21% at short term, 22% at medium term, 11% at long term, and then 46% of you are doing multiple models. Thank you for that. That's helpful. So yeah, this section will do an overview of the housing models. We'll talk about some typical activities, some typical challenges, and then a little bit more about which tiers might align with which model. So next slide. All right, short term. Emergency shelters are considered our immediate solution for trafficking survivors who need safety. It's responding to a lot of emergencies and crisis. Shelters can help with providing things like food, hygiene products, clothing, other kind of basic needs, while they're doing things like safety planning, and then maybe addressing things like legal needs. They are typically shorter term, being in emergency shelters. I would encourage you to not limit it. I've seen a lot of shelters who terminate program participants after like 30 days, 90 days. And I strongly encourage you not to do that. We are meeting survivors where they are. And so when we think about what kind of tiers we can implement here or what might fit best, we're thinking about kind of shorter term things. Because survivors might be there for a couple days, survivors might be there for multiple months. We really don't know. Economic empowerment is not really a focus here. There's a lot of focus on kind of the urgency of other things, which makes sense. You know, you're thinking about safety, you're thinking about immediate resources, and those are all essential things to do. However, it is important to start kind of introducing these opportunities, thinking about economic stability, thinking about longer term safety. Trafficking survivors, because of what they have experienced in particular, can find themselves in a financial situation that can kind of push them to returning to traffickers. And so while they might not be ready to really like engage in all of the economic empowerment tiers, you can assist with other areas and you can help them access financial resources, feel more economically stable. And so we can kind of reduce that risk for trafficking survivors to return to traffickers. There are so many reasons why survivors do return to abusers, which in shelters is often like, I can't bring my pet with me. So one of those things is this feeling financially unstable. So yeah, crisis management. The primary goal of this tier, this crisis management tier, which is in this box, is really eliminating or kind of mitigating these barriers. So what are the barriers around them completing any kind of educational or training or employment programming? Survivors often have a lot of those unmet basic needs that do make it really difficult to access and maintain that stability. So meeting those unmet needs is super critical to help them transition out of this crisis into, you know, the medium term, the long-term housing stability. With some crisis management, you can, if you're working in a shelter, you can do a lot of community mapping. What is out there, you know, what kind of partnerships could you build? And then thinking about how you're going to build those strong collaborations. There are a ton of resources in the guide that I encourage you to check out to help you with things like community mapping and collaborations. Shelter staff often do make a lot of referrals. And so your partnerships are going to be really important again. And so when you think about skill building and work readiness. You might be offering things around goal planning, or you might be helping them fill out job applications. You might be helping them write resumes, finding interview clothes, like Caroline mentioned, the Dress for Success. That kind of intentional engagement will help them build skills within the shelter too. And so they kind of have the internal shelter structure and offerings, while also having offerings from your partners too. When I worked at a shelter, I know, like, we had a computer lab, and so everyone could come in and use the computer lab. I think there were only like 3 computers, so it was like not everyone could access it. So we often send them to the local library so that they could apply for jobs too, which leaves them applying for jobs alone. And I will say that this was not an OVC program. And so it was very case management, and it was very, here is your case management plan. And every week we check in on your progress, and we're going to monitor you, and we're going to track you. And so you go to the local library and you apply for 20 jobs this week, and you bring back this list of the jobs that you applied for so that we can measure your compliance. Again, please don't do that. We're meeting survivors where they are. I saw so many case plans that said the same thing for everyone. And then the weekly check-ins were not so much check-ins, but more about, did you do what I told you to do? And so, yeah, again, this was not a survivor-centered shelter that I worked at. And so I encourage you to, use this tool as a way to think about things in a different way. I know that that wasn't something that I had in my brain to kind of actively explore, like, what else could we be doing? It was kind of like, well, this is what we've always done. This is what we've always offered. So this must be right, if this is how we do things.
Could I add here, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
And it elevates all of the things that you have said. With short-term emergency shelters, as Wayne said, like, you're dealing with such a short period of time, you're dealing with like high anxiety, high emotional sort of experiences and turnarounds. And so trying to go and create a whole new economic empowerment situation that doesn't feel the most feasible. But what I do encourage all of you in short-term emergency shelters to consider is, how are you approaching your intake and onboarding process? And is that process empowering? Is it honoring survivors' voice and choice? And a good example of that is this. A lot of us as case managers or advocates or whoever, we operate from a very, let me do this for you because you need some help. You're going through it. Right? And we're not really operating from a, let's do it together. Let me empower you to be able to fill out this application for your food subsidy. Let me empower you to be able to make that phone call, to schedule that doctor's appointment. We kind of take over that as case managers or whoever, because we care, and a lot of times, because unfortunately, this field is built on a savior system sometimes that is not, that we could always improve and get better on. So that would be the action item when it comes to skill building and crisis management, is to look at how are you delivering your information and how are people engaging with your short-term emergency shelter? And are there opportunities in the way that it's already designed to build in more opportunities for survivors to practice their self-advocacy skills, to practice their public speaking, to practice their application skills, their following through on a appointment skills. Those are all skills that are going to help regardless of what the economic empowerment goal of that person is. And you don't just all of a sudden say, okay, today we're going to start working on it. You have to build it into the onset of your program as something that you are helping to build throughout that process. So go ahead and think about it that way. And then another area of feedback, and then we can move forward, is a lot in the focus groups, we were told that a lot of survivors were never asked, what do you like? What do you feel you're good at? What do you enjoy? That even us as advocates, you say that we're, all the things, even we were not asking them that, right? So if there is another action item that you can just put into your intake that will support the economic empowerment journey of the survivors in your short-term program, is to at least ask that question, right? Because it gives you a lot of information that you can then go and build relationships in the community with.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that. I'm actually going to pause after each of these slides so that you can jump in because I love it. So yeah, next slide. Okay, so medium term. We're kind of thinking here around 6 to 24 months of a time period. Survivors are kind of moving more towards that long-term stability, sustainability. Those kind of activities are kind of focused around preparing survivors for that long-term permanent housing. Housing advocates are often helping with things like the housing search, relocation assistance, the rental subsidies, any kind of like healing supports that they're interested in. Ongoing safety planning, like don't forget the safety planning, that's super important to offer. And then again, different kind of referrals into the community as far as like supportive services, culturally specific healing services for that medium-term range. This is a really, really great opportunity and a great time frame for survivors to start looking at what kind of skills they want to build, what kind of options do they want to explore. And then for us as advocates or as housing staff members, we can help them think through, and we can also assess our partners for what kind of positions are safe, what is of interest, and then what's going to provide a living wage too. We're trying to move away from this just take any job that you can get, apply for 100 jobs and just do whatever you have to do, to really think about that match. So like, what is a good fit? As Caroline brought up earlier, there can be a lot of anxiety within this medium-term housing because there might not be a clear plan for sustainability once the program ends. And so while you're doing these economic empowerment offerings, it's helping them too with feeling like there's a plan forward. You're helping them engage in things like the skill building, the experience building. You're helping facilitate connections. And so something to think about too, as far as that anxiety goes, is to not wait till the end. Make sure that this is an ongoing strategy, that from day one, you are doing these things. You're helping them prepare with like taking on rental payments without that subsidy. As far as like the tiers that could align with medium-term housing, crisis management stuff can still come up. That's pretty normal. Career exploration, again, rather than just having them apply for anything and everything that they can find, You're thinking about your partnerships. So can you partner with maybe local community colleges? Can you help them with different career interest assessments? Can you bring in guest speakers? The shelter I worked with could have brought in guest speakers as well. So just to say, like, again, the tiers aren't something that's fixed. Guest speakers could have absolutely come into the shelter. They did not take that opportunity to do that, but guest speakers can always be really helpful to kind of open their eyes to what's available, what is out there, what dreams can they have about the future, what things did they not know about. I didn't know about technical assistance before I became a TA provider. This was not even something that I imagined doing with my life. Didn't know it existed. So a really common challenge is that survivors don't show up. Like, you have your workshop and you think, you're doing everything to be engaging, you're doing everything to be interactive, but survivors don't show up. So again, what Caroline said, you've really got to get that ongoing feedback. We really need to be asking survivors, what do you want? What do you need? And then trying to figure out how we can either do that internally or partner with people who can do that externally. What type of training activities would be wanted? What would be helpful? When we think about skill building and work readiness, it might be a good time to think about ongoing education goals. So maybe community colleges, maybe it's a GED class and then taking the test. Maybe it's like English as a second language classes. You're really going to collaborate with partners, assess partners for safety, train partners for things like trauma-informed care, to make sure that those are safe places for them to be. And then along with that, with this experience building, collaborating with workforce development to build partnerships there. You're thinking about places who might offer volunteer positions or internships, hopefully paid, but we know that there are a lot of people who do unpaid internships. Any kind of like shadowing that they can do to kind of a day in the life of a possible job that they are interested in. Different kinds of apprenticeships, and then thinking about leadership opportunities. How can they kind of be a part of, collaboratives or councils or task forces to help them with those kind of experiences. And then employment. As you're building relationships with employers, again, think about that trauma-informed workplace, the trauma-informed supervision. Match survivors with their long-term goals, match survivors with what is a good fit, what is a good environment, what helps them, be the best version of themselves and be a part of their goals and dreams for the future. Survivors are often put in this position of, you'll take what you can and we expect you to do that. So even within housing, we have this one unit, you take it or you leave, you take it or you're back on the streets. We really want to move away from that as far as housing goes, and then as far as employment goes. So yeah, think about these programs, think about these work places to find out if they're effective, if they're relevant, and if they're supportive environments.
And I want to add you to that's perfect. I want to give an example of what I've seen in the field in relation to this. First, thank you, Wayne, for talking about the importance of helping someone cultivate their dreams and their interests and their desires. The feedback that we've gotten in the field from survivors is that when we're looking at all of the tiers, career exploration is the least utilized within the human trafficking field. And that's because Waynette is saying, you know, it's always like, take what you can get. This is the job. This is the partner that we have. And the focus is so much on security, right? Like it's so much on just getting someone enough money to make it, right? That it's not necessarily on developing the skills and the dreams and the vision of someone. We're not giving survivors the same level of respect that a student is maybe getting at a local college or getting at, you know, from their teacher, right? And it's like that level of care and sort of expansion of dreaming that we need to bring into this work, you know, and a big part of that is first shifting our own perspectives of what we think survivors are able to do, right? And what they're interested in. And so that's just to let you know how that career exploration piece can be a really helpful tool in gathering information from your community on what they want to do or see when it comes to economic empowerment. And then on the back end, being able to build in those relationships into the infrastructure of what you're providing within your 6-month program. Does that make sense? So career exploration serves many facets of what we need to do this work well. And so if you're looking for a place to sort of focus on, especially when the resources are feeling very, they're still feeling all over the place, career exploration would be a wonderful place to start, regardless of what housing model, to gather information, but to also empower some of those self-efficacy skills that a survivor would need in order to follow through with whatever the next step is, you know? So we can't just say, go apply to that community college and we haven't allowed the person to even explore what that program would give them, right? So we have to think about it in that practical way. Like if this was you, what would you want someone to engage with you on when it comes to this journey? So I just want to lift that up. And then it's a thing that you can do during that thawing out. Because remember our first study, it was 6 months. We're still, you know, survivors are still thawing out, right? But you can still do some really meaningful career exploration within that thawing out time that maybe even helps to for lack of a better way to put it, speed up that process because of the safety and the environment that's being provided. And so the one other example is I have seen housing programs strategically partner with an adult school in their community and have the teachers of that adult school come into the housing facility, right, based on signing MOUs and things like that, to provide things like ESL, to provide things like different courses, depending on what the training is. So that is one tangible example of what that could look like, is bringing someone in-house to provide some of these skill developments and experiences. Thank you.
So I'm seeing a question, are you able to engage survivors in ongoing management of these housing needs and simultaneously create jobs for them? I feel like I have questions about this question, but I feel like this is about capacity, like staff capacity. Medium-term housing can be really intensive. We'll talk about a little bit about like rural issues, but I think that especially the state of housing right now, it's going to take more of your time and your effort and engagement with survivors than I think when the housing situation was, quote, better. And so you might also think about like your caseload amount. I always encourage, especially rural programs, to lower their caseloads so that you have time to build partnerships, whether that is with landlords or whether that is with, workforce development opportunities. So I'm not sure if that's where you're going with the question. but yeah, like, I think that we get into this mindset of once you're housed, you're done. You've got this figured out. And so we think that we can pull back, and that we can serve 100 families when realistically, we have to think about house as not being done. Like it's the start of a new journey. Okay, next slide. All right, long-term programs. This is our long-term stability. The length of stay varies. It kind of depends on the funding source, but it's like an indefinite amount of time. It's ongoing. Advocates can, partner with different kind of housing programs. For example, like if you're an advocate and you have survivors that end up in something like Section 8, you might think about that partnership and how you can still provide ongoing advocacy, or maybe that's part of your follow-up services. It is really this opportunity to focus on all 5 tiers. And it is definitely based on, again, the needs of your survivors of trafficking. They can really have the time to engage in this experience building. They can also think about kind of that mobility while you're providing these wraparound services and supports. So thinking about the possible tiers to implement, you've got some experience building and you've got some employment here highlighted. But again, you have this ongoing relationship with the survivor. You can really focus on all 5 here. Economic empowerment is not really focused on in permanent housing because, again, we have this mindset that once you're housed, you're done. And there's criticism about like housing first programs because it's like, oh, we're just housing them and dumping them. That's not what it's supposed to be, though. We're supposed to be providing ongoing wraparound services and supports. They're not done. They're not finished. They're not complete. We don't toss them away in our minds. We build in more opportunities. And even with long-term permanent housing, you're still thinking about things like safety planning. I know that when I worked in shelter and housing, we had hired an employment and education case manager, and she had started doing all of this programming. And I walked in on it on accident as a housing case manager and had no idea what was going on. I had no idea that it was happening, even though I shared an office with her, because it wasn't seen as something that was for the housing survivors. It was seen as this is for our shelter participants. And so I didn't even find out about it, even though we had weekly case meetings. The case management meetings were more about, whether or not participants were complying with their case management plans rather than kind of opportunities for them. And so also when you're thinking about implementing these things, also thinking about how you're letting them know so that everyone knows about it. Yeah, Caroline, do you want to say anything else about that?
No, you did great. It's ongoing. Thank you.
All right, next slide. Okay.
Oh, is it me or you? Sorry about that.
Go for it. No, it's all good.
So we are now going to talk about the intersectional group. So now you have the housing model, right? And so now we're going to talk about the different intersectional groups and some of the barriers that are most consistent with those groups. And some of you have already put in the chat box, like, oh, I work with a lot of, immigrants and English as a second language. Language is a barrier. Or, from the deaf community, I think someone lifted up a great resource. Thank you for that. for that community, you know? So we're gonna go a little bit deeper into like the intersectional strategies based on what the barrier is that way to economic empowerment. And Kitty, yes, it is possible to re-engage with me. I'll write down your, or if you can send me your email, I'll reach out to you to learn more. Thank you so much for being here. And so the first thing that I want to talk to you about before we go into each of the intersectional groups is that there are principles that need to be in place when we're dealing with anti-trafficking community and economic empowerment. And there is a guide that we're going to put in that allows us to talk through what those principles are. So I'm going to name them right quick, and then we'll go to the next slide. The first is just remember that regardless of what intersectional group you're working with, you want to center survivor voice and choice within your programming. You want to make sure that you're incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we know that there are things like occupational segregation, where certain communities have not been given the same opportunity to access that particular career field. So there's a lot of extra work that needs to go into making sure that, you know, some of these pathways are inclusive. And that might not be your role as an advocate, but it's something to be mindful of, right? You know, as you're assisting someone in navigating opportunities. And then another principle is, you know, you want to meet the people where they're at, you know, and meet them with lived experience, and assisting them on an ongoing basis, which is what Wynette was talking about when it comes to long-term housing. If you can go to the next slide. What we know, though, is that our communities have many barriers. And if you can show the next slide, many barriers to education and employment. And so research has unfortunately shown that the more obstacles you have, right, the less likely you are to complete an education program or to complete, you know, some sort of employment, you know, situation. And we also know that one of these barriers is trauma. And so if we look at some of the research, there's one called Dreams Deferred, which was a 2018 study, and it showed that 66% of survivors reported that their education and training had been disrupted as a result of either someone who was abusive to them or a result of some of the obstacles that they have. So we don't need to go into what the barriers are because you all have listed them great. Everything from transportation to legal issues, childcare, health, language access, you name it. But this is just to let you know that there are some obstacles that really get in the way of doing this work. And so we're going to talk through, you know, what to do in that situation based on the audience. And then we also know that a lot of these barriers, then the severity of the impact tend to be higher for Black and Indigenous and people of color. You know, we know that they tend to be higher for LGBTQ communities. And unfortunately, that means that within our anti-trafficking communities that are made up of many of those individuals who are the most vulnerable, we're often dealing with a person that is living in that 4 to 6 to 7+ number of barriers range. And so that makes the work so much harder. It doesn't mean that it's not possible. You just have to go back into the idea of time and the right environment, building out more time to do this well. And it's not going to be in 6 months, but it's really asking yourself, okay, within that 6 months, what can we do to set someone up for the next phase or strategy? If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we'll send it over to Wynette to kick us off with what should you consider if your audience is youth?
So the big thing about economic empowerment is how big of an impact this can make on the rest of their lives. I think that any work that you can do with children and youth is basically preventative work. That kind of early intervention is so profound. They might not have that awareness of different kind of like average, mid-range employment opportunities. Most people, when you ask like what are some jobs that you can think of, are like, you know, doctor, lawyer, CEO, or they think about like working at McDonald's or kind of customer service or day labor. You know, no one says tea provider, which is really strange to me, but don't overwhelm them with this kind of concept that this is the rest of your life. You know, pick a career and stick to it, and don't waste your time doing other things. Even if they aren't planning on using a skill later on, the skill building is really a great thing for like their resiliency too, for kind of those protective factors. Some of those protective factors are things like skills and talents and interests. But make sure that they know like their path can change a lot. And then as they're going through all of the different tiers, offer these opportunities to kind of process and express their feelings. Something that I've seen a lot with youth is they get really excited about a new job, but even positive feelings can become like a negative feeling. And I saw a lot of youth who would get into kind of self-sabotage, um, which seems strange on the surface. And you might not understand things that happen with self-sabotage, but there's an element of control that if I think this is going to end, I can end it on my terms, I can end it on my timeline. And when things have been constantly taken away, you don't expect things to stay. So there's also that element of, I'm really excited about this, but I know I'm going to lose it. And so there's the feelings of grief that comes before something has actually happened yet, because of what they've experienced. Next slide. Okay, rural challenges. Capacity is a huge issue. You might not have the funding and you might not have the staff time to engage in all of the different ideas that are a part of these tiers. That's okay. Think about how you can, take the next step, how you can create an action plan, and then what kind of things you can do feasibly now, and then what kind of things might you think about down the road. You might have limited skill building and work readiness opportunities. Your partnerships, therefore, are going to really need to be creative. Think outside the box about your partnerships so that you can be more strategic about who knows who can apply for this, what kind of doors can this open. Local face-to-face meetings tend to be really important, especially in rural communities. So building that partnership, take time to be face-to-face, to be in person with your partners. You might have some virtual access to some resources depending on your infrastructure, that can fill some gaps. But again, it depends on infrastructure, and how glitchy your tech might be. And then the impact of turnover. Turnover can really hurt your progress and hurt your timelines. And when you lose your one economic and employment person, it can take a long time to replace them too. All right, next slide. All right, culturally specific economic empowerment. There are so many factors that can influence our decisions that we make, especially decisions around education and employment. If I were to ask you how you feel about handshakes, we'll probably get some mixed answers, especially after COVID. But when I ask you about the level of eye contact you prefer, we'll get a variety of answers. When I ask you how you define respect or how you define professionalism, we'll get different answers. Our beliefs go into this. Any kind of like historical, intergenerational, multi-generational trauma, our family's experiences, our community expectations, our own past experiences within the system influence how we go about our days. And then the degree of assimilation required for engaging in opportunities matters too. So when you think about how you respond in different ways, survivors of trafficking will also respond in different ways and have different values and beliefs. And this can impact, where their money goes, their beliefs about like climbing the ladder and this hierarchy, what disrespect and what insubordination means in the workplace, how you expect a flow of information within your workplace, who you're, quote, allowed to interact with at your workplace. I've been at places where it's like, don't talk to the CEO. They're above you. They're better than you. So don't even like make eye contact with that person. The value of certain people's titles. And then also thinking about how we define success. I've said it multiple times that we consider success once they've been housed, but then also, broadening our own definition of what success looks like. And then thinking about how our cultures impact what success can look like, what it feels like, what you're striving towards, that it might not be the expectation, it might not be the mainstream, and that there's this whole value and belief system that goes into the decisions that we make all day long.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, and we have a couple of other intersections. So I'm going to kind of move us a little here and there, and then some exciting news is that I'm going to be hosting office hours, and so then you can join us at that time. We'll send you the link and continue the conversation. So if we can go to the next slide. The first thing that I want to lift up to all of you is we got a question from someone who's saying, hey, I'm working on putting together a vocational program for survivors. Like, is there any research that's showing that this is helpful, right? Like, or I'm looking to do this or that or the other. So I want to lift up something called the Pathways to Work Clearinghouse. It's been created by the Administration for Children and Families. And in this clearinghouse is research of just about every economic empowerment program that you could think about, and what their measures were and how successful it was and what the results and the findings and things are. So I just want to send everyone there, right? Like if you're thinking about starting a program or incorporating something, education, whatever, into your space, and you're wondering, is this effective? Is this evidence-based? Go ahead and check out that clearinghouse to support whatever it is that you all are building or doing within your housing program. So that's the first thing I want you all to have. And then with the last few minutes, I'll talk through these last three groups, and then we'll just go to the last slide so that you know how to contact us and continue the conversation. So for those with disability or are neurodivergent, right? The most important thing is to not make assumptions about how they learn, how, those of us who are neurodivergent or have an ability function and move through the world. Unfortunately, we do that too often, and then we end up limiting the resources and the opportunities that are available to them because we've already limited them based on what they've disclosed about their neurodivergence or ability. So that's the first thing, strike out those assumptions, ask questions, get to know the person in front of you. And then there is a really great evidence-based model called supported employment that can be very helpful for those with disability, with significant trauma, with substance abuse issues, and different things like that. So check out that link in the chat box. And then another resource is Activating Change that does TTA around disability, justice, accommodations in the workplace. Next slide. The next that I'll talk about is for survivors with a criminal record. We partnered with a great resource called the Survivor Reentry Project that focuses on helping survivors who have a record as a result of their sex or labor trafficking or whatever it may be, work through criminal record relief, vacatur, and things of that nature. So I encourage you all to look at this amazing resource. It talks about essentially helping a survivor build evidence of rehabilitation. So you as an advocate and a housing provider or whoever you are in your community can assist them with building evidence of rehabilitation that then supports them in their application for a loan or whatever it may be, right? And so there's information about how to work through that and navigate that challenge of a criminal record. And Gerald, if you visit me at office hours, we can talk deeper about it because I know that's an area that you were interested in. Next slide. And then we'll open it up to questions. The last is for immigrant survivors. The first thing that you need to know is that you can help this survivor navigate the U and T visa process. And so we'll have some conversations around what that means so that they have legal right to work. And then the best practice for this group, is to really help individuals get an I-10 number. And that I-10 number will allow that immigrant survivor to be able to do consulting work, to be able to start their own business, and engage in some level of getting income, regardless of what their status is. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but there's some resources there for immigrant survivors. Next slide. And then we're not going to go through this, but the biggest part is just 2 and 3. I hope that you're walking away understanding that you want to take a strength-based approach. You want to be excited, right, about helping someone discover what they're good at, what they're interested in, where they want to invest their time. We give 40 hours, some of us, to this situation called work, right? So we might as well have a conversation of where we want to invest that. And then be creative. This field is, you have to be creative. And during our office hours, if you bring some challenges that you're experiencing on the ground, you and I can engage in some conversations about what creativity looks like. With that said, we have 2 minutes. Are there any questions? Do you have a handle on the number of trafficking survivors? Oh, now that is a great question, Gerald. I do not have the answer to that question, but we can figure it out. Any questions? We apologize for the rush of it all. Just remember that there's an entire workforce development system that's supposed to help y'all. Okay, like we're not saying go out and become a job developer. There's an entire Department of Labor workforce development system, and these links here show you how to access those resources. Everything from ESL to I mean, you name it, they have it. So we just want to leverage that up. Yes, Tabitha will be sent out.
Go ahead, Caroline. I'm sorry.
No, I was just telling Tabitha the resources will be sent out, and I'll pass it back over to you, Meg.
No, that's exactly where I was going to go too. Look at that. So yeah, thank you everybody so much for attending. If there's any last minute questions, you can feel free to also drop those in the chat box. And if we don't get to them today, we will follow up with you. Additionally, Abigail, if you could go to the last couple of slides with our resource library link on them, that would be great. So we will be sending you all these resources as well as the recording of this webinar today in an email in a couple of weeks. So keep an eye on that in your inbox, wherever you registered for this webinar with, you will be getting these resources and this recording and the slides. So we will be sending those out to you as well. Additionally, we have some other resources for you here on the screen in case they are helpful and you're interested. So we have Futures project here that we are sharing on their behalf that you can scan that QR code for to get more information about that. We also have information about our resource library at Freedom Network, which just provides a lot of free resources, webinars, things like that on trafficking and housing and interrelated things. And then we also have our training, or excuse me, our housing email up on the screen here. Feel free to reach out to that if you have any lingering questions today, things that you would like some more information about, or if there's anything else that we can help with. There have been a few other things dropped in the chat for you, so please take a look at those before you depart today. And then next slide, please, Abigail. All right, we will also be sharing on the screen here Futures virtual office hours. I know that was talked about a little bit in our webinar today, so please take a look at that. Go check out that link that's provided to sign up for office hours so that Caroline and Futures can engage with you all and help you through some economic empowerment things. And the next slide, please, Abigail. All right. Well, with that, all of that being said, thank you all so much for attending today. We will have a brief survey for you all to take at the end today to just let us know how we did, things that you're looking to learn more about in those intersections of housing and human trafficking, and just ways that we can continue to improve this experience for you. So thank you so much on behalf of the Freedom Network Training Institute housing team for joining us today, being so engaged in the chat and sharing your information and curiosity and kindness with all of us today. Thank you also so much to Caroline and Wynette for providing this phenomenal webinar full of so much important information. You have been so great to work with, and I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else attending here today did too. So thank you all so much. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and keep an eye out in the next couple of weeks for that follow-up email full of resources and the recording from us. Take care, everybody.